So, what scope is, and what local or function scope is, and global scope is, and how they work together, hopefully is clear now. Now let's have a look at block scope, because that's actually another scope we have in JavaScript. Now important, block scope is only a thing if you're working with let and const. And that's really important. Let and const are two relatively new additions to JavaScript. For a long time, they have not been part of JavaScript, but since ES6, we do have let and const. They give us new ways of defining variables and constants, and you'll learn a bit more about that, and especially about constants in the primitive versus reference value module. But generally, they give us new ways of defining variables or variables which we never change, which would be constants. The different thing about block scope compared to variables with var, where we have local and global scope, is that block scope gives us more places in our code where we create a new scope, essentially everywhere where we use curly braces, as long as we're not using them to create a new JavaScript object. I mean curly braces when we use them in if statements, in for loops, and so on. Whenever you use curly braces and let and const inside of these curly braces, you actually define and declare a variable inside of that block which is surrounded by that pair of curly braces. And that's different from var. Let's see this in action, and for this I'll actually add a new file here, block-scope.js, and rename the first one to local global-scope.js. And then here I will change this import to import block scope. Not the other one, not the local global scope, because we don't need this right now. Block scope, of course, is an empty file again now. And now here, let's add some code. And let's again start with good old var, but in a bit of a different way now. If we have a if statement here, where we check some condition, and for a start, let's check for true, which is of course always true, but I'm just using this to show you what happens if we make it into this block here. This here is a block. So if we have this if statement, inside of this block, so between these curly braces, if we use a variable, my age 31, I can console log that here, but I also can console log it here after the if statement. If I save this and go back to the browser and reload, we see 31 being logged twice. Now, what is the implication of that happening? The implication is that this here has to be global scope, because otherwise using it here in line 7 would fail. If this would be in some kind of local scope inside of the if statement, we should only be able to use it here, but not here. Essentially, that's what we saw before with the function, right? If we had a variable in a function, we could only use it in there. With if statements, that does not seem to be the case. And I can tell you it's also not the case with for loops, while loops, switch statements. All these statements don't have their own scope when, and that's the important thing, when using var. It changes if we replace var here with let or with const, does not matter. Actually, let me repeat this, comment out this line so that we have it for reference, and now create a new line here and have let my age. Now if I save this and I reload that file without any other changes, you see I get it being output once from line 5. So that's coming from this line here. But for line 8, we actually get an error here that my age is not defined. And the reason for that is that concept called block scope. As I mentioned, this here is a block. Basically, any pair of curly braces you see in JavaScript constructs a block. The one exception is if you have some object, which you of course also create like this. Well, that's not a block, that's just a JavaScript object here. That's a data type. So that's not a statement between which you could put expressions. This is instead creating a new piece of data. It's technically a different thing. But for all other curly braces you have, you create a new block, and that's what we're doing here. Indeed, you can do something which you barely see in JavaScript. You could add a pair of curly braces here, just like this in the code, and have my name here, now a constant to mix it up, and we would also not be able to output my name there, because this also creates a new block. It's just something you don't see in JavaScript often. Typically, you work with some kind of statement which has its own block. But this also is a valid block, not tied to a specific statement, but just a block of code. And if we now comment out this my age log, so that the script doesn't crash, and we save this and reload, we now get an error from accessing my name as well. So this also is a block. So here we have block scope, here we have block scope, and this is a block, really important. And block scope simply gives us a more fine-grained control over our variables, because we don't just have global and function scope, but now we have scopes everywhere. And maybe this sounds like a bad thing, because all of a sudden you're a bit more restricted regarding where you can use variables. But that's actually a good thing, because this extra restriction forces you to write cleaner code and to be clearer about where something should be usable. So it actually is a restriction that ultimately leads to cleaner code. Now, what if you actually define my name here? Where can you use that, and which kind of scope is this? Is this now global or a block scope? It seems global because it's not inside of a block, there are no surrounding curly braces around it, it's not inside of a function. So what we learned before tells us that this should be global scope. It kind of would be, but actually it's not, because this uses the const keyword. Therefore, this also is block scope, technically. You can kind of imagine an invisible pair of curly braces around your entire script. It doesn't really matter how you call it though, if you call this your block or global scope, because if you define a constant or a variable with let on this level, just like global scope, it is available everywhere. In every if statement, in every for loop, in every function, it behaves exactly in the same way. So this is similar to global scope here. Hence, of course, if I console log my name here in the if statement, which is always true, you of course see that Max is getting logged there. So this kind of global scope exists too, but technically we call it block scope. You can, however, call it whatever you want, you just need to know how it works.